What's good, everybody? It's your brother Mad Black, the most dangerous and the most toxic black man on the internet. And I'm black up in your face again with some more pro black commentary. So, not too long ago, I released a video on my channel basically talking about how these feminists like to lie and spread a lot of ridiculous narratives about the relationships of our past generations of black people. So, like on our grandparents, they'll make it seem like all black relationships and all marriages were toxic. Like the black woman was just sitting in the house and cooking and cleaning, and she was being physically and verbally abused by her husband. Or if the husband wasn't like abusing her, he was across town making another family or having outside children or just cheating or whatever, right? So that's the narrative that they build out there. And I acknowledged in that video that, you know, I'm sure that did happen in some cases, but that was not all the relationships that existed back then. Okay? I'm sure there was cheating. There's been cheating since the beginning of time, right? But that's not all the relationships that existed back then. Okay? That's not how, you know, the lives of our grandparents or great grandparents was actually lived. Okay, and if you have grandparents or great grandparents who are alive, they can tell you the truth about what really went on back then. Okay, but when I saw when I was sitting there thinking about that video, and if you haven't seen it, you can go watch it on my channel. It's called Modern Feminists Are So Miserable That They Try to Drag Down Our Ancestors with Them. Okay, and I'll post a link to it in the description box and in the comments section. But as I was sitting here thinking about that whole situation, I noticed that these feminists don't bring up the flip side of that coin. They always want to put a lot of negative energy on the males in the community and make it seem like all males have just been bad throughout all time, right? Like they make it seem like all black men have just been abusive or cheaters or whatever. What they don't acknowledge and what they don't talk about are some of the negative aspects of the females from those times. And what I mean by that is, they leave out the stories of the black men who are raising children that weren't his. And what I mean by that is, there were females back then who were married to a man, but they would cheat on him and have someone else's child. And because DNA testing was not a thing back then, these men went for years just raising someone else's child. And then maybe years later, the child will find out who their real father was, or maybe they would never find out, or maybe, throughout the family, people would know, like an aunt might know, or, one of the other grandmothers might know who the real father is, or, you know, these secrets would just be kept and then people would find out years later, or would come out, during a funeral, or come out during like a medical crisis, like they need like a blood donor and they find out that the child is not a match for the father or whatever, or organ donor or something like that, right? So that's when these things like come up. But I notice these feminists never bring up those types of situations. Like you never hear of the women back then being scandalous. It's always on the men. It's always the man was doing something bad. We never talk about the females who do things that are just out of pocket and disastrous, really, to a relationship where they would have a child by some other man that's not their husband and just lie about it. This happened a lot during because there were a lot of wars going on that happened when a man was on deployment. He comes back and he thinks that's his child, but the dates don't really match. You know what I'm saying? That's happened during every war, really. And this is not a black thing, by the way. This happens in other communities as well, but I'm just bringing it up within the context of what happens in our community. Or, there's women who mess around with some other guy on the other side of town or something like that, right? So it happens. Or messing around with the mailman or the milkman or whoever that just stops by the house while the husband's at work. And, these things happen. But once again, these feminists never bring up those situations. And that happened a lot too. Just as much as you want to say that there were black men who were abusive, like they were like Mr. from The Color Purple, there were black females out there who are scandalous as well. So at least should have some balance, right? If we're going to have these discussions about past toxic relationships. Now, a certain situation just came up with a very famous black person, and it showcases what I was just talking about. And if anyone's seen it or heard of it, it's the situation with Kirk Franklin. Kirk Franklin is the gospel producer who's produced a lot of hit records, and he just found out who his real father was, and found out that his mother's basically been lying to him all his life. Now, he's had a very sad life in the fact that his mother gave him up and he was adopted, so he has a lot of issues with that. But even so, he thought that there was a man who was his father who passed away from cancer, I believe, and come to find out that that man was not his actual father. It was another man that he, had been, lived around in the same neighborhood for years and just didn't know, right? And I guess a family member pointed it out that this man looks exactly like Kirk Franklin, and he does. He looks like an elderly version of Kirk Franklin when you see them side by side. And they went and got a DNA test and found out that that's his real father. That's his biological father. And he went to confront his mother about this, and she claims that it wasn't true, and she wanted another test. And even after the second test, it proved once again that that's his biological father. So his mother lied, and she's still in denial about it. Kirk Franklin did a whole little documentary about it. It's on YouTube right now if you want to go watch it. I watched it yesterday. But I just find that very interesting. That does happen a lot. But now it's not as easy to get away with now because of DNA testing. And I see a lot of men get online and say that DNA testing should be mandatory. And then you know what? I'm actually for that. I often don't agree with a lot of the nonsense that comes out of the manosphere, but I do think DNA testing should be a little bit more mandatory now that it's more readily available, and not just to prove paternity, but so I'll just give you a insight into my situation. There's some genetic issues that my wife has that we had to test for our child to make sure that, and they had to test me to make sure that I didn't have these same genetic traits so that it wouldn't pass on to my child. So we had those same tests done, and it was basically like a DNA test just to make sure. So just to make sure I'm not passing on, because if both parents have the same trait, the odds of the child having these issues goes way up. So that's what we were worried about. So things like sickle cell, like my wife has the sickle cell trait within her family. She doesn't have it, but she has the trait for it. So we have to be careful about that. I don't. So we lucked out with that with our child that she had, but she does have the trait now, just like a lot of the females in my wife's family do. And likewise, just some other genetic things like kidney disease and whatnot. So these are things that we check for. So DNA testing is not all just about paternity. So there are things that I think should be mandatory just to check for, making sure your child might have or not have certain health issues. These are things I think that are good to check for just so you know what to be prepared for, because you don't want to wait until the child gets older and then develop something and then you have to worry about it then. It's kind of better to know ahead of time, getting these tests done. That's just my opinion on the thing. So getting a DNA test is not always a bad thing. Because I know a lot of females get offended by that because they're like, well, how could you question the paternity. But I mean, we got to be honest, there are a lot of scandalous females out there who lie. Or sometimes it's not even about being scandalous. Sometimes it's just the shame of it. They don't want anyone to know, right? And it's easier for them to just lie rather than just come out and tell the truth about who the father of their children is, right? So, like I said, that's one of the things I agree with, and it's something that we could have an honest conversation about, right? But just be careful out there. You know, I do agree that these paternity tests probably should be something that's mandatory. Everyone should get their children checked, especially if you're not even in a committed relationship, right? But once again, this is the stuff that the feminists don't bring up. They make it seem like every female out there is just sitting back being innocent and chaste and nothing's going wrong out there, right? They're not doing anything wrong. It's all the men being bad. And even in those situations where these females cheat, they'll still blame the man somehow. Like it's still somehow the man's fault for them cheating and getting pregnant by somebody else. But you folks let me know how you feel about it in the comments section. I very much like to hear your opinions on this. Anyway, Mad Black, and I will be back with my foot on the devil's back.